John Sweeney is a British investigative journalist and writer. He worked for the Observer newspaper and the BBC's Panorama and Newsnight series. Many of you will see the previous conversations we had, and I think our conversations tend towards the slightly darker outcomes of what could be happening, what could be going on, especially in relation to Trump. I expect the last couple of weeks are darker and more pernicious than certainly I could have imagined. I'm not sure if John saw this coming, but we seem to be in a very dark and sinister place indeed. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Thank you so much to everybody who subscribed, everybody who helps to share the content, everybody who supports Ukraine. And as many of you will know, we raised funds for trucks earlier in the year. We delivered those to Ukraine. We're now raising funds for drones. There is a link in the description there. The funds go directly to the charity. I've met them on the ground in Lviv. They're wonderful people with an incredible operation. So please do help support that if you can. It's never been more important than it is now to help Ukraine remain resilient. They are the shield and sword of Europe in a quite literal sense. John, welcome back to the channel.
Hi.
Let's start with that idea of cynicism, because I think you have been consistent all along in saying that if Trump talks like a Russian asset and smells like a Russian asset, then he's a Russian asset. Now he is behaving uh, to the benefit of the Kremlin. So is what he's doing something that was on your trajectory? Was it on your bingo card? Or are we in a darker place than you could have imagined?
I'm afraid to say that what's happening is darker. In particular, the betrayal that's in this morning's papers, which is that the United States has stopped sharing intelligence with the Ukrainians. There are two elements to this. The first of all is the offense. It makes it much more difficult for the Ukrainians to attack the Russians. And of course, in a war, part of successful defense is keeping the enemy on their toes, keeping them on the back foot, so that that's a serious problem. But the second part is Ukraine's ability to defend its cities from attack, and in particular the capital, Kyiv. So they're under constant drone attack, and then the drone numbers are going up. I can remember back in the day when Kyiv or Ukraine was hit with something like 15 Iranian Shahed drones, and there was a big thing. The numbers keep on going up. There's like 100 a night, and now we're hitting something like 200 drones a night. Then there's also the missiles. Now, American intelligence, this comes from satellites, spy satellites, etc., has been incredibly helpful for the Ukrainians in terms of them being able to deal with with the missiles in particular, but also the drones. The Americans have been telling them, watch out, these missiles are coming, they've been launched here. And so that makes Ukrainian air defense able to knock them out of the sky before they hit the big city, in particular Kyiv.
And
And
it's more
now,
problem. I was going to say it's more problematic, isn't it, in a way, because just this idea of cutting off U.S. intelligence, it's not a clean cutoff because a lot of this information is gathered, collated, processed, and analyzed via GCHQ. So, in effect, by cutting Ukraine off at the knee, this is surely also an attack on the security of Western Europe.
yes, but the critical thing is that this makes it much easier for the Russians to murder dozens and dozens, and then looking into the future, hundreds and then thousands of Ukrainian civilians. And then that in turn will cause a refugee panic if America doesn't change its mind. Now, Europe can help with some of this, but the problem is that we have, Britain is part of Europe, in my view. I am a Liberal Democrat and I make no apologies about that. But we don't have enough time to build up and these kind of air defense capabilities because we always would rely upon the Americans. The British Army, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy can do lots of good things, but too much of Europe's defensive shield has been based on American stuff. No, Trump has pulled the plug, um, ostensibly because he's not satisfied with the minerals deal that Ukraine was offering, and um, because President Zelensky was disrespectful when they met. Now, I watched that bullying with horror, and to be honest, Jonathan, it reminded me of when at the age of 10 we moved from Manchester to Hampshire, and I was bullied at primary school because I had a funny accent, and I felt I felt alone, and I had no friends, and it was very, very tough. And I can remember being bullied, and that's exactly what that behavior was. And the suit.
Yep.
He's not wearing a suit because Ukraine's under martial law, and he's got a symbol. He wears what he does because everybody in Ukraine and the Ukrainian army is fighting for Ukraine, and he's the president. So he doesn't have a gun. He doesn't go to the trenches, although he's gone pretty close to the front line on many, many occasions. Good on him. But it's a symbol of his country under attack. And for the MAGA people to mock him for this is rude. And I was pleased to see our sweet king, invite him to his home in Sandringham. And the king, of course, was wearing a fancy suit, and he doesn't give a monkeys about what he was wearing. Really, I felt that the bullying was deliberate, and it was an attempt to humiliate Zelensky so that he had to stand up for himself. And the moment he stood up for himself, then he was in the wrong. What are you doing? Oh, well, I'm like, he's standing up for himself. He's standing up for his country. And Trump's saying things like, I think my favorite kickback from Zelensky was, it's because of me, because of the javelin, says Trump, you would have been finished within 2 weeks unless. And what's so horrible about that is it completely takes away what happened, which is that the Ukrainians were incredibly brave, and they fought like tigers. And it wasn't Trump's gift of the javelins which bought them time; it was their courage. And anyway, so Trump said that 2 weeks, and Zelensky goes, "Oh yes, yeah." Putin talked about 3 days, and it felt okay. So essentially, both the Russians and the Americans are on the same side now. And the Ukrainians are fighting two czars, not one. The
And
red czar, the czar in blood in Moscow, and the orange czar,
mm,
the marmalade czar in Washington, D.C.
the
And
Cheeto Czar, I think, is being called as well. Yes.
what the Cheetos are. What's a
It's
Cheeto?
it's a horrendous chemically kind of orange crisp snack. So you know,
Yeah, yes. I like the marmalade czar, but um, anyway, the effective consequence of their actions is that if they carry on like this, uh, thousands of Ukrainians will die really quite quickly. Now, the freeze in military supplies, that is also a terrible thing to do to the Ukrainians who are fighting for their lives, fighting an existential war. But the Ukrainians have got enough stocks that they can last till the summer, maybe 6 months, maybe longer. They're very tough before Europe can start catching up and arming, and all the sounds. To be fair, what the French and the British and the Germans are all saying, it's all good. That we just need time to get ourselves going, and we're in the right direction. But cutting the intelligence sharing helps the Russians in real time immediately. Um, And the likely cost of this is going to be thousands and thousands and thousands of civilian lives. Ukrainian civilians will be looking at this and thinking, my kids, etc., were getting out. And so if Trump continues on this course, there is likely to be a massive, fresh Ukrainian refugee crisis. All of it Trump's fault. Does he care? The problem is that Zelensky is absolutely right, but Trump lives inside a disinformation bubble. But a bubble explodes, and then there's another bubble, and another bubble, and another bubble, and the people who are reporting all of this to his supporters and who voted Republican, who voted for Trump, are themselves effectively Russian assets. I'm talking about Fox TV, Newsmax, all of this. They're coming up with stories that Zelensky is the problem. No, Russia invaded Ukraine. And so what we're dealing with is a kind of dark fairy story. The Trump supporters believe that black is white and white is black. And Trump believes what he sees on his TV, and it's his stuff being relayed back to him. And there's nobody around him, it seems, who has the moral courage to say, this is wrong, boss. We shouldn't be doing this.
And the
No one.
Democrat in the chamber who stood up and protested, of course, was hauled out. And then Trump's first statement was, we've brought freedom back to America. Well, that's a very curious type of freedom. I wanted to rewind slightly to the theatre, the puppetry of the Oval Office, because I now have several of my sort of Republican friends and colleagues who at first were parroting the line of disrespect and blah, blah, blah. And this is all Zelensky's fault now, that this is happening and that's happening. I think they are starting to see that actually there is a pattern behind this. That if you rewind to what we're seeing now, the plot to have Zelensky removed, the conversations that the US is clearly having with so-called rivals of Zelensky, the fact that Yulia Tymoshenko and none of these people poll anything above 4%, makes it look more like an attempt at a regime change coup on the part of the US. And indeed, many of these measures to cut aid and intelligence, these would predate the theatre episode in the Oval Office. It's just a convenient way to pin that on Zelensky, rather. And an interesting statement by Andrei Eleonarov, who I think is relatively reliable, a previous Russian foreign minister. He essentially said that he was aware of many of these moves we're seeing now prior to what happened in the Oval Office. So what's your view on this being just a little bit of kabuki theatre, and actually Trump has sided with Russia, made that decision. We don't know when, but clearly it predates the Friday events.
Yeah, he has been consistently derogatory of the Democrats for supporting Ukraine. Now, it was possible during the election last autumn to view Trump's position on Ukraine because Biden was supporting Ukraine. Then I'm going to attack Ukraine because I do the opposite of what Biden does. But the speed with which he is betraying Ukraine and the ferocity of the betrayal is such that it makes me think ink black thoughts are the right ones. That Trump is not just he's not attacking or betraying Ukraine because Biden supported Ukraine. He's doing it because he's been mentally captured by the Kremlin. Now, there are the various elements of this. You can look at a Venn diagram or whatever. You've got bits and pieces. The big picture is, what are we looking at in terms of the effect of what he's doing? The effect of what he's doing is that that Ukraine could collapse within 6 months, possibly faster. And what you've got is an economic collapse, a social collapse, and a military collapse. Of the three, the military collapse is less likely because the Ukrainian army is good and brave, and they have enough bullets and stuff to keep them going for 6 months. But the Russians so much more.
But also, the
Secondly,
Russian offensive capability has been steadily going down, and indeed now they're being rolled back in Turetsk. So it seems the Russians are, when we say they've got so much more, it does not seem they're able to deploy it at this point. And over the last 3 months, their ability to project violence on the battlefield, not obviously glide bombs and stuff, but on the battlefield has been steadily degrading.
yes, hence Betrayal. One of my friends who's in the Ukrainian army was telling me just now, actually, that Turetsk is part of the Pokrovsk front, and the Russians are taking the decision, let's get Kursk back. And the Ukrainians are in trouble in Kursk. It's also true to say is that because of, both sides have got drones, the Russians have got many, many, many more drones, both the Shahed drones, which they're using to terrorize and attack civilians in the Ukrainian cities, but also they have loads of these small first-person view battlefield drones, drones with wires on, etc., etc. They have many, many more drones than the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians are really good at their drone use. What it means is that it makes it much harder to attack because the other side can see what you're doing. And I think in January, Russia's losses were like 20% of their total losses during the entire 3 years. And the reason for that is because Putin was saying, get Pokrovsk and kick the Ukrainians out of Kursk. This is the little bit of Russia that Ukrainians have taken in the summer. Now, the Russians were unable to do either of those objectives, and they lost an awful lot of people doing that. And the fundamental reason for that is because, and General Zaluzhny, the former general, who is now Ukraine's ambassador to London, said is that the war is now a stalemate unless there is some new technological development. The problem with what the Americans are now doing is they are changing the stalemate in Russia's favor. But also there are, as I said, there are three components. There's the social component, the economic component, and the military component. Ukraine has been doing very well militarily. Now they're being betrayed by the Americans. The same applies to the economy. The Americans and the Europeans have been with the Ukrainians money to prop up the hryvnia, so it's been stable for the whole 3 years. The money has been good. Now, what that means is that there isn't a nightmarish fight about inflation, about the devaluation of the Ukrainian currency, all of that. And because that makes fighting a war so much tougher. Now, again, if Trump, some of this stuff is happening in the shadows, but I suspect that Trump will undermine the economic fronts and the economic war as well. Now, Europe can step up with that much faster, but it can provide military stuff. But then that's a big cost to Europe, and it's a kind of overnight cost. Now, yes, Europe is wrong. I never want Britain or our friends and allies in Europe ever to be in this situation again, where we depend on American goodwill to defend ourselves. This is a terrible mistake of national security, because suddenly in the White House we have a friend of the Kremlin, an enemy of everything we stand for, and this is catastrophic for us too. But the timescale, it's absolutely catastrophic now for Ukrainians. It's very, very bad for all of us soon. And the next thing is if the Russians succeed more or less in Ukraine, then I can imagine, Estonia is 40% Russian, partly because the Russians move people to Estonia. It's a tiny country, but they're fighting for their. I can imagine there'll be Russian-generated trouble in Estonia next. We also know, you see the real battles happening in Romania. At the moment, they're court battles against the TikTok Nazi who got more votes than everybody else because the Russians were helping him. So there is a real fear that Russian power and influence, it's not going to stop in Ukraine. It's going to carry on and carry on because Putin is like this. And then, by the way, and the third component is a social front, a social war, if you like. If Trump doesn't reverse, then you will have an economic collapse, a military collapse, and that will lead to a social collapse. And now, but there are versions of this where the collapse isn't complete, but nevertheless, so for example, the Dnipro is a very good barrier. But if the Russians come through Belarus and down, Belarus sits over the west bank of the Dnipro, so they lose that advantage too as well. Does Trump realize what he's doing? And the answer to that is no, because he lives inside a disinformation bubble. But both Macron and Starmer, and I would have thought some people inside the Pentagon and the CIA, the good people who are left, who haven't been beheaded professionally, will be pushing back. And then there's an issue it's not, we can't call it yet, because it's possible that Trump will reverse and change his mind. But what it looks it looks like the darkest chapters or passages of my book, Killer in the Kremlin, are right when I point out a story by, for example, former head of the Russian department at MI6, Christopher Steele, who's a friend of mine, in which he says that the Russians have got sex compromat on Donald Trump. By the way, I don't think that's the whole story.
I suspect there's a lot more motivating him now than that, and fear of that, if he's even afraid of it anymore.
Well, so I think there's that, but I also think there's economic compromat. And by the way, the sexual compromat won't be nice. So if some of your listeners are saying, "Oh, well, what's Trump to be embarrassed about?" It'll be done. The Russian dark state is good at what they do. They know what they're doing, and they'll have something Trump doesn't like,
It's going to be
i.e.,
kids or something horrific, right? It's going to be
or,
something
or, or for
terrible.
example, or him not being able to. I don't think he's a paedophile, and there's no evidence that he was like Jeffrey Epstein. But for example, that he's having sex with a beautiful prostitute. He can't come because he's too old and knackered and fucked, and he assaults her. And you see the whole sequence. Or there's a story that there was a Russian beauty queen from this bizarre beauty queen nonsense, who was his girlfriend who lived in Trump Tower. She seemed to be pregnant, and then the pregnancy gone. So he paid for an abortion, and that could hurt him with the evangelicals. But I also think, when I said in broad brush that he's been mentally captured by the Kremlin, he likes the way Putin's has power, wields power, and is jealous. He'd like to be Putin, and that is so. I think it's very likely, more likely than not, that the Russians have got some compromat on him, also money compromat as well. sex compromise, money compromise, but also the other thing, which is that Trump wants Putin to like him. Trump wants to go to Moscow. He wants to have that to stand in the Kremlin and watch the Russian tanks go by. That there's blood on the tracks of those tanks doesn't seem to bother him at all. Now, I'm qualifying this because it's possible Trump will see that what he's doing is mad and bad and wrong, but we're not seeing it happen. We're not seeing that message get through yet. So the other source of qualified optimism is his mad, bad, and wrong economic policy, tariffs. All nationalism is wrong, and economic nationalism is even more stupid than normal nationalism because you end up cutting off your nose to spite your face. And that's what he's doing. Sanctions against Canada, guess what? Canada's putting sanctions against the United States. Because of the weird way the US oil industry works, they actually buy a lot of Canadian oil because that's easier to process in their oil refineries than the stuff that's coming out of the ground from Saudi Arabia. So American oil refineries find it cheaper to buy Canadian oil. It's crazy what he's doing. And I think quite quickly, he will be compelled to reverse this process. I think that he will reverse the tariffs. He'll obviously, Trump being Trump, he'll blame somebody else. So it's possible that his and by the way, I think this economic boomerang is going to hit him faster than the political military boomerang from Ukraine. But a number of things are becoming obvious, one of which is that Rheinmetall's share price has gone up 49%, and American defense stock is tanking. By the way, the American defense companies are very good at lobbying, and there's a certain point at which, if you buy American and the Americans say, well, actually, you can't use that to defend Ukraine, then the signal goes out to everyone, don't buy American, because you can't bloody use it when you have to. And that is a terrible message. So the cost, the military and economic cost of Trump's Ukraine policy is terrible for the United States and terrible for the proper projection of American power. Essentially, he's selling the shop. He's selling the farm to the Russians for a bag of beans. And it's weird he doesn't see that.
Unless, of course, because dictatorships thrive in adversity, especially when they can project that blame onto others. I mean, this is one of the reasons why Putin is entrenched in power, is because he keeps his people in penury and
he keeps
trauma.
he keeps in penury and trauma. And the other thing, the reason I love democracy and hate dictatorship is because dictatorship is so boring. I mean, I've spent not my whole life or anything like it, but I spent quite a bit of my life going to places like Zimbabwe or China, and there are no interesting books in these places. Also, Castro's Cuba too, as well. The Soviet, there are, and the other thing is that Biden was too weak and too timid and didn't give the Ukrainians enough stuff in a proper fashion. And he will go down in history as the man who failed the Ukrainians, but not the man who betrayed the Ukrainians. That's Donald Trump, or rather Vladimir Trump, as we should now call him. But at least under Biden, you didn't have this horrible thing of every morning of waking up to hear the latest crime of Donald Trump. And part of this awfulness of dictatorship is it invades your headspace. I like democracy because I know that there are checks and balances with the Prime Minister, and, for example, ours, and I know that under Rishi Sunak and now under Keir Starmer, they are essentially reasonable human beings who were in power due to whose use of power is trammeled by a series of checks and balances, which we've developed over time, over the centuries through history, which makes democracy so much better than dictatorship. Trump's an effective TikTok dictator now in the United States. We'll see just how robust the things are, but that's what it feels like. And part of what dictators do is they bore you stupid. So you kind of want to, I'm a huge fan of, great supporter of Ukraine, but it's all I do. I write books about. I'm writing a novel about the Battle of Kyiv. I'm thinking about all sorts of other projects, and part of me wants to unplug. I don't want to keep on thinking about Trump anymore. In a democracy, you can do that. In something that feels like a dictatorship, which is what America feels like right now, you can't. So what's so awful for the Ukrainians is they're living inside Donald Trump's madness. It's like being trapped inside somebody else's schizophrenia or paranoid insecurity. While he's accusing them of disrespect, while he is aiding and abetting the enemy, which is murdering their people. I mean, how dark can it get, mate?
It's beyond, I think, what we imagined in our conversations, despite, certain suspicions that we explored in those conversations. And this is where I guess our imaginations need to unfortunately probe that very sort of dark, fetid place. What could he do next? Is it becoming clearer that he's likely to lift sanctions, that he's likely to render the oil cap? Because if Russia, and of course his economic actions, his trade wars are going to potentially tank the price of oil, because if economic activity slows down, that's almost an inevitable result is the reduction in oil price. That finished off the Soviet Union in the 70s, tanking oil price. It was one of the reasons why it eventually crumbled and folded. But if he removes the oil price cap and normalizes exports, that's sending a lifeline to Putin's regime, a lifeline to his economy, a lifeline to his war machine. What are we likely to see in terms of Trump's next moves, and how dark could that get?
Well, he's got a problem in that he's not going to enjoy his state visit if that happens, if he does that. So right now, Starmer and Macron are doing their level best to get through to Trump to say, stop doing this, this is wrong. And the number one head of the list is the intelligence sharing. Carry on doing that. What are you doing? You want Ukraine to lose? Now, and I don't, the problem is that Trump is unpredictable, and I don't want to exclude the possibility completely that he will reverse his project and start and begin to accept, yes, Zelensky's got his own difficulties too, and therefore he can he helps Ukraine and reverses
Does
his
not seem
position.
probable at this point, though. I have to interject.
No, I'm just setting that out because I don't want to say definitively um, um, what I think is going to happen will happen. So everybody who's listening can get the point that this is not what I'm about to predict is not a fact, and Trump may reverse because he is unpredictable. Having said that, I think actually Trump is more predictable than not. He said he doesn't support Ukraine. His pick for the vice president, J.D. Vance, is a creeping creature that creepeth upon the face of the earth, who should be flattened. And instead, Trump gave him permission to be grossly bullying towards Zelensky. And Vance has got previous saying, I don't care about Ukraine. Now, why should you care about Ukraine is because both my grandfathers fought in the First World War, and my father fought in the Second World War for a simple principle that it is wrong for a nation to invade another nation and hope to steal their land. This is wrong. And that principle has meant that of course, there's been wars, of course, there's been exceptions, but the general point is that we have lived, certainly in Europe, with peace and prosperity since 45, because everybody gets that principle. And as time has gone on, fewer and fewer countries have sought to invade other countries. This is part of the 21st century, the modern world. And Trump and the Russians are going backwards on that. And it seems that Trump wants to reward the Russians for their military aggression, not punish them. And therefore, this is his logic. And essentially, it is, how can I best help the Kremlin? How can I best help Russia? And that would be to scrap the oil cap, scrap Russian sanctions, and the problem for Europe is the moment America starts trading with Russia, starts buying Russian oil, then European sanctions collapse because there is no united front. So, for the moment, things are dark, and it feels like they're getting darker and darker and darker. A couple of thoughts to mitigate this gloom. The first of which is America is the richest and most powerful country on earth, but the 21st century, and the world's always been like this, the world is a very, very, very interconnected place. People like Alexander Dugin, who wrote this script a long time ago, the first thing we need to do is split Britain from Europe. Brexit, thank you, Nigel Farage. Then to split Europe from the United States, that's happening in real time. And then you, rather than getting a world where you've got the West versus the East, democracy versus tyranny, you now have a series of weak liberal states fighting two or three tremendous autocratic giants. And those autocratic giants right now are Putin's Russia, Xi's China, and Trump's United States. And the little fish can go hang. That feels to be Trump's worldview. And he says lots of stuff. He is more predictable than not. He's in favor of all of that. But he doesn't understand that the world is a much more complicated place than it. So, for example, he does economic autarky against the Canadians will fight back. He does economic autarky against the Danes because of Greenland, then Europe will fight back. I mean, today on Twitter this morning, I'm so appalled by the failure by the Americans stop sharing intelligence that I've called for a boycott of American goods. Now, as best as one can, but for example, I do love a rum and coke. Well, from now on, it's going to be neat rum, whatever, but no coke, thank you. I don't need to drink Coca-Cola. I can find other things to do, other drinks to drink. I'm going to start and very happily not go to McDonald's or KFC. These are simple things we can all do, and say so because we need to puncture the information bubble or the disinformation bubble that surrounds Donald Trump. The problem is, if that diagnosis is actually too mild, then actually Trump's disinformation bubble is a mask, and behind that mask is somebody who is a creature of Vladimir Putin.
So, my focus over the coming weeks is going to be to highlight what we can actually do rather than despair. What can we actually do to resist this? Because Russia is far weaker and more brittle in some respects than it's given credit for. And unfortunately, it is actually better in drone warfare and other aspects, including what seems to be a major military reorganization internally, which General Syrski has recently been talking about. They are becoming more of an effective fighting machine. They are learning, and we ignore that actually at our peril. So what can Britain do? What can Europe do? Ideas such as seizing the sovereign assets of the Russian central bank, such as maybe being bolder and putting together a coalition to close the skies over Ukraine. What are your ideas for what we should be doing and how quickly we should be doing them?
Well, there's a difficulty which I get is that there is you've got to give, if Trump's going to change his mind in reverse, you don't want to lose that possibility, because all of the good things we need to do to help Ukraine are going to cost us an awful lot of money. So the best and cheapest solution for everything is for Trump to reverse. But we can't keep on hoping for him to play nice while he continues to stab Ukraine in the back with a fresh dagger every morning. We can't allow that to happen. So there's a certain, and I understand, by the way, when Starmer says, "Oh, I've got a letter from the king. Please come to on a state visit." I understand what's going on there. I understand what Macron's trying to do, but it looked as though Trump got Macron to come over, and more or less, Macron was clever and stood up to him well, and Starmer was not bad either. But basically, more or less, you got a sense of Britain, of France and Britain doffing their caps to Trump's power, showing that they were barons who owed fealty towards Trump. And there were some disagreements, but that's the general drift. The moment they go home, Zelensky sent him to the royal presence, and King Donald fucks him every which way. And the the problem is that Britain and France has already said have already played too nicely with this man. The question is, apparently, the stories in the papers, what's going to happen next is Zelensky's going to go back, sign the deal, but this time with Starmer and Macron holding hands. And I'm not sure that Trump will let that happen, because he doesn't want that to happen. So there's a certain point at which Britain and France's hopes of getting Trump to reverse, there's got to be a clock on that. Now, I would say a week, and then they should reverse the decision not to share intelligence with Ukrainians. That's critical. And if it carries on for longer than a week, then I think we're looking at Trump being captured by the Kremlin, because that's what all the evidence points in that direction. And I think the British and French hopes of turning Trump around are turning into folly, and then we should go for it. So, for example, there's something like $200 billion worth of Russian state gold in European banks. Now, and there is a downside to doing this, which is that there are people who say you've got to respect sovereign money. If you don't respect sovereign money, then they could steal our money down the track, and that is why we're not doing that. That's why we're not taking this dark Russian gold and giving it to the Ukrainians so they can defend themselves properly. I want to say to people who are worried about protecting sovereign money, what scenario do you envisage when you think, okay, actually the risk of not doing this is greater than the risk of protecting the notion of state sovereign money? Because right now we're about to see, if things carry on in this pro-Kremlin direction, we're about to see the collapse of Ukraine, a fresh refugee crisis, which is all our fault, and then enormous pressure on the Baltics and the southern European states, because Russia is like that. Essentially, what's happening here is a recreation of Stalin's Soviet Union in the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 as designed by Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. Those are the borders that Putin's aiming for. He wants that back. So I'm going to say to the people who protect state sovereign money, are you out of your fucking tiny minds? Hand over the money. And what we do is we give it to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians they develop their own defense business, and they're doing very well at it, but also they buy European and British defense stuff. And by the way, that helps us get out of the recession that Donald Trump is causing because of his fucking tariffs. So it's a win-win. Do it now.
This could, of course, include unlocking the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is the largest pool of money. And again, there seem to be some noises edging towards that. Inconceivable a week ago, now perhaps seen that it is crucial that the US represents an existential threat, not just to the security of Europe, but its viability, its very independence. So there's some interesting conversations starting to happen, perhaps.
Yes, that would be beautiful if the by the way, I've been on holiday to Norway. It's beautiful. Everybody must go. And while everybody's there, you say, you've got to help the Ukrainians. The new German Chancellor, that's a ray of sunshine after a lot of gloom. So there's a series of frankly silly locks on the German economy and its ability to spend money when necessary. And right now, and Merz, the new chancellor, has said, "I'm shooting the locks off the treasure chest. We need to open it. We need to spend serious money." Again, Germany's in trouble in part because of Chinese electric cars and the electric car revolution, led, of course, by the openly neo-Nazi supporting Elon Musk. And again, this is virtuous, i.e., the Germans get to do some proper Keynesian economics and spend money on their defenses and help Ukraine with their defenses. So we should do that. We should, if the Russians get closer to the Dnipro, we should send boots on the ground, not onto the front line, but we should put British and French troops into Ukraine to train the Ukrainian army and to do all sorts of things, non-lethal, but for example, the medical stuff. If we did that, it helps the Ukrainian. What it does is we're doing a lot of the medical stuff, which and a lot of the support stuff. So we're helping them. So that and the Russians are aware of that. I.e., there is a line they should not cross because they're going to start hitting. This is an organization which is NATO less the Americans. But and I think the issue is it's down to this is it's right and proper to give Trump a bit of time to reverse his pro-Kremlin madness. It's wrong for that clock to run and run and run and us do nothing. So there's a certain point where we, the British and the French, have got to say to the Americans, share the intelligence with Ukraine. If you're not going to do that, then we're out and we're going to rebuild a new architecture which keeps Europe at least safe and strong. And you, America, have lost a ton of good allies. And the idea that you can trust Vladimir Putin as a friend, well, that's beyond foolish.
Indeed, we probably need to be doing that behind the scenes, even while these sort of entreaties are going on. He gets a bad press, but it does seem that under Chamberlain, at least we were reviving some of our defensive capabilities at the same time as sort of appeasing on the surface.
So Chamberlain was infinitely better than Trump. What he made a series of catastrophic mistakes, but when the Nazis, having got Sudetenland, they then betrayed the Munich deal and then took the rest of Czechoslovakia. Then Chamberlain sort of said, right, let's build some more Spitfires. We're at that moment right now. We should be doing that right now. And we need to stand up to our and to the Americans and say, no, this is not good. Boycott American goods because of Trump. I mean, I spent my entire life admiring so much of America. And right now I feel disgusted and betrayed. And I feel disgusted and betrayed and afraid for my Ukrainian friends. And I want to say to the Americans who support Trump, you are mad. You're mad to trust Trump. You're mad and cruel and wrong to abandon the Ukrainians. Stop it. And if you don't stop it, then we will rebuild at least our part of the world without you. And we will not forget your betrayal and your treachery and your disgraceful conduct at this dark hour.
On those words, John, I think we'll have to end it there on those incredibly strong words. I can't add to that at all. Thank you so much. Stay strong, get some sleep. I think there are many people who are feeling also abused and traumatized in this space, the pro-Ukraine space, and worried for your friends. But despair is not the answer. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Cheers, Jonathan, and Slava Ukraini.
Хорем слава, смерть ворогам.